Most people assume that the predator always stays a predator and the victim always stays a victim. Neat little boxes, right? But human psychology doesn't live in neat little boxes. It writhes, shifts, bleeds across boundaries, and does things that would make your jaw hit the floor. So let's rip the curtain back. Let's talk about the things they never taught you in any classroom. The dark, twisting, stomach-churning ways the human mind gets played, flipped, sculpted, and wired by the people around it. Buckle up, because this is going to get deeply uncomfortable in the best possible way. Here's something that almost nobody talks about. Sometimes the manipulator catches feelings. Yes, you heard that right. The very person who set out to dominate, control, and trap someone else ends up emotionally wrecked by their own game. This is what happens in reverse Stockholm syndrome, a phenomenon that flips the script on everything you thought you knew about power and captivity. Stockholm syndrome, the one everybody knows, is when a victim develops a strange emotional bond with their captor as a survival mechanism. Their mind basically says, if I like this person, maybe they won't hurt me. But reverse Stockholm syndrome is the wolf falling in love with the sheep it was supposed to devour. The abuser, the kidnapper, the manipulator starts to genuinely care about their target. They start to see them as a real human being instead of an object to control. And once that crack opens, the whole wall starts crumbling. This happens because of several psychological forces working silently in the background. When a manipulator spends extended time with their victim, familiarity starts doing its sneaky work. There is a well-documented psychological concept called the mere exposure effect, which basically proves that the more time you spend around someone, the more you tend to like them. It is almost mechanical. The manipulator didn't plan for this. They never expected to. Look at their captive and feel something real. But guilt also begins to chew at them from the inside. Some abusers start shifting from being a cold oppressor to becoming a reluctant guardian. They justify their protective behaviour as concern, as if that somehow cleans their hands. In some twisted cases, the manipulator even starts seeking the victim's approval, reversing the entire power structure they originally built. They become dependent on the emotional responses of the person they were supposed to own. Real-world cases of this have appeared in hostage situations, toxic relationships, and even within cults. Some captors have released their hostages out of pure emotional attachment. Some abusers have cracked under the weight of their own guilt, unable to keep pressing down on someone they've grown to deeply feel something for. The consequences are messy. The manipulator loses control of their original intent. The victim might sense the shift and use it strategically. Legal proceedings can be impacted. The entire dynamic becomes a psychological storm. What it teaches us is this. Even in the darkest corners of human behavior, empathy has a way of showing up uninvited, and sometimes it burns everything to the ground. Now let's talk about something far more calculated, far more predatory, and frankly, far more dangerous. Imagine someone studying you like a textbook, your favorite music, your deepest fears, the way you laugh when you're nervous, the phrases you use. When you're vulnerable, they memorize everything, and then they become you, or at least the version of you that you've always wanted to find in another person. This is dark mirroring, and it is one of the most vicious psychological weapons ever used on another human being. Normal mirroring happens all the time. People unconsciously copy each other's gestures, speech, and energy as a way to bond. It feels warm. It feels like connection. But dark mirroring is that same behavior hijacked and turned into a loaded weapon. A predator who uses dark mirroring doesn't genuinely align with your values or interests. They are performing a role. They are building a fake bridge to your heart so they can walk right across it and own everything on the other side. The chameleon effect is real, and it's deeply wired into us. We are drawn to people who seem like us. Manipulators know this. They weaponize it. They feed your confirmation bias, because when someone appears to share your beliefs, your brain automatically assumes they must be trustworthy. You stop looking for red flags. You stop asking hard questions. You feel understood, maybe for the first time in years, and that feeling is so intoxicating that you throw your guard wide open. The psychological synchrony that dark mirroring creates is almost hypnotic. The predator doesn't just copy your opinions. They mirror your emotional states. They appear to feel exactly what you feel at exactly the right moment. And when someone seems to understand your pain precisely, your insecurities, your private dreams, you become dangerously willing to share more, give more, trust more. This is where the trap snaps shut. You've handed them every key. They've positioned themselves as your ultimate confidant, the one person who truly gets you. And from that position, control becomes effortless. Romantic predators do this constantly, mirroring a partner's personality to hook them fast before dropping the mask entirely. Cult recruiters use it to make new members feel like they've finally found home. Corporate manipulators use it to make clients feel so seen and so understood that they sign on the dotted line without thinking. Even serial predators use dark mirroring to appear charming and completely normal until it's far too late. The damage this leaves behind is catastrophic. The victim doesn't just lose trust in that one person. They often lose the ability to trust anyone who seems to understand them, because understanding itself becomes a threat. Their identity erodes because the version of themselves they expressed so freely was then used against them. The betrayal hits at the deepest level. To protect yourself, you have to become skeptical of connections that feel instant and perfect. Nobody aligns with you that quickly unless something is off. Test it. Introduce small false details about yourself and watch whether they adopt those details into the mirroring. Watch for cracks in there. Consistency over time. A real person has their own life, their own contradictions, their own separate emotional world. If someone seems to have none of those things, if they feel like a perfect reflection of you, walk away. If dark mirroring is the slow poison, then the black swan manipulation technique is the bomb going off in the middle of the room. This one doesn't creep up quietly. It detonates. The black swan manipulation technique is named after black swan events, those rare, utterly unpredictable occurrences that rewrite everything. Think of it as a manipulator deliberately engineering one of those events in your personal life. Not a gradual erosion of your reality, but a single stunning, disorienting moment designed to blow up your mental footing and make you reach out for the nearest stable hand, which just happens to be theirs. The power of this technique lies entirely in its shock value. When something truly unexpected and alarming happens, the human brain does something predictable. It shuts down rational processing and goes into survival mode. Your prefrontal cortex, the part that analyzes and reasons, basically gets shoved out of the driver's seat. Fear and confusion take over. And in that window of cognitive vulnerability, whoever steps in calmly and offers guidance or clarity becomes your anchor. The manipulator has engineered this whole scenario to be that anchor. They created the storm so they could hand you the life jacket. Cults are notorious for this. Extreme initiation rituals or staged supernatural encounters are used specifically to shatter a recruit's existing worldview, leaving them mentally naked and desperate to fill that void with whatever doctrine the leader is selling. Political propaganda works the same way. A manufactured crisis, a sudden terrifying claim, a shocking revelation, all designed to override reason and push a population toward compliance. Toxic partners do this too. A fake emotional meltdown, a staged emergency, a sudden devastating accusation, all timed precisely to destabilize you right when you are starting to feel confident or independent. The consequence for victims is a chronic state of hypervigilance. You start living in constant anticipation of the next shock. Your nervous system stays on high alert. You become easier and easier to control because your baseline is now anxiety. The defense is simple to name but hard to practice. Pause. When something shocking happens, force yourself to wait before responding. Ask whether this situation could have been engineered. Look for patterns. Has this person caused similar crises before? If the answer is yes, the bomb was built on purpose. There's another kind of trap that doesn't look like a trap at all because it's dressed up as self-improvement. It tells you that you need to go deeper, reflect harder, examine yourself more thoroughly, and you believe it because the pursuit of self-awareness is genuinely valuable. But this is exactly what makes emotional quicksand so brutally effective. Emotional quicksand is what happens when the act of self-reflection is twisted into a weapon against you. Instead of reflection leading to clarity and growth, it leads you in circles, sinking you deeper into self-doubt with every rotation. Manipulators love this technique because it's invisible. They never have to lift a finger. They just plant the idea that you're not quite self-aware enough, not quite emotionally evolved enough, not quite working hard enough on yourself, and your own conscience does the rest. You start questioning every thought, every reaction, every feeling. You analyze your motives so obsessively that you forget how to just act. This is analysis paralysis turned into a lifestyle. The victim gets so deep into introspection that they can no longer trust a single impulse or instinct. They need external guidance to make even the smallest decisions. which of course means they need the manipulator. This plays out in toxic relationships where a controlling partner constantly suggests their significant other isn't emotionally mature enough. It shows up in abusive workplaces where the message is always that you're not quite good enough yet. Cults thrive on it, keeping followers in endless cycles of spiritual self-examination so they never develop the confidence to question the leader. Therapeutic abuse even weaponizes this in the hands of unethical practitioners. The emotional drain of living inside a perpetual loop of self-questioning is crushing. You stop trusting yourself. You stop taking action. You freeze. And in that frozen state, you are completely at the mercy of whoever offers to interpret your internal world for you. The way out is to recognize that genuine reflection has a direction. It moves you forward. If your introspection is keeping you paralyzed, someone has turned your self-awareness into a cage. Fear is free. Or at least that's what manipulators would have you believe. In reality, fear is the most expensive currency in psychological manipulation. It costs you your clarity, your confidence, your freedom, and your ability to think straight. The fear currency effect is the phenomenon of fear being manufactured, inflated, and traded to buy obedience and control. Manipulators don't just threaten you once and walk away. They keep the fear circulating. They make sure the threat always feels present, always feels relevant, always feels just around the corner. This sustained fear does something devastating to the human mind. It triggers the same biological responses as actual physical danger, flooding your system with cortisol, narrowing your focus to immediate survival, and making long-term rational thinking nearly impossible. When you're that scared, you need someone to tell you what to do. And the person holding the fear is very happy to oblige. Governments have used this for centuries. An enemy at the border, an economic collapse looming, a shadowy threat to public safety. These narratives are carefully curated to keep populations compliant and distracted. Media amplifies it because fear drives clicks and eyeballs. Corporations create cultures of job insecurity so employees never dare to push back. Abusive partners use the fear of abandonment, of violence, of being exposed or humiliated to keep their victims glued in place. Religious groups use the fear of divine punishment or eternal damnation to ensure nobody strays from the doctrine. The common thread is that the fear is rarely as immediate or real as it's made to feel. It's manufactured to be just intense enough to override your reasoning. When you understand that someone is using fear as a transaction, as something they hand to you in exchange for your compliance, you start to reclaim the power to refuse the trade. Critical thinking, media literacy, emotional resilience, these are not luxuries. They are the antidote to a world that profits from keeping you afraid. And then there's guilt. Oh, guilt. Few emotions are as perfectly suited for manipulation as guilt, because it lives inside your own moral framework, which means it's nearly impossible to argue with. Phantom guilt syndrome is the art of making you feel guilty for things you never did, never caused, and never had any control over. It's guilt without a crime, and it is absolutely devastating to live with. The mechanics are ruthless in their elegance. A manipulator doesn't need to explicitly accuse you of anything. They just need to create the impression that somehow, in some way, you are responsible for their pain, their failure, their suffering, their unhappiness. They use tone rather than words. Silence instead of accusation, a look instead of a statement, and your own conscience, trying to be good and responsible, fills in the blanks. The more morally conscientious you are, the more vulnerable you are to this. People with strong ethical values make the best targets for phantom guilt because their own internal moral code becomes the weapon used against them. You feel guilty for setting a boundary. You feel guilty for having needs. You feel guilty for living your own life. Over time, this guilt becomes automatic. Your brain starts generating self-blame in contexts where it doesn't even remotely apply, because it's been conditioned to do so. The self-policing this creates is extraordinary. You don't need to be watched or controlled. You've internalized the warden. Parents use this on children to keep them emotionally tethered well into adulthood. Controlling partners use it to make their significant others feel responsible for everything that goes wrong. Political ideologies use it to make people feel complicit in systemic problems they had no hand in creating. The only exit from phantom guilt is to pause and ask a simple, hard question. Did I actually do something wrong? Not do I feel like I did, but did I actually? That distinction is everything. Now let's move into something more time-released and more insidious. What if a manipulator could plant a seed inside your mind that only blooms into pain months or years later? What if they could engineer your emotional suffering to arrive exactly when it would do the most damage? This is emotional time bombing, and it is as calculated and cold as it sounds. An emotional time bomb is a trigger, a phrase, a memory, an association, a gesture that a manipulator carefully plants during an interaction and then allows to lie dormant. At some future point, the right circumstance activates it, and suddenly you're flooded with guilt, fear, shame, or confusion that seems to come from nowhere. But it didn't come from nowhere. It was built and placed there by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The Zeigarnik effect is part of what makes this so effective. Our brains are wired to remember unfinished emotional business with sharp, persistent clarity. Unresolved things nag, they resurface, they pull focus. Even when we desperately want to move on, a manipulator who understands this plants seeds of emotional unresolution, leaving conversations incomplete, leaving certain wounds half open, saying things that don't settle quite right, and ensuring that your mind will keep circling back to them long after they've left the room. Toxic relationships weaponize this constantly. The strategic reminder of a past mistake right before an important moment in your life. The callback to an old vulnerability. Right when you're starting to feel strong again. Some cults are masterful at this, implanting deep fears of divine punishment or spiritual failure that follow former members for decades after they've left. Political narratives do it too, refreshing old fears just often enough to keep a population on edge. The psychological cost is enormous. These emotional grenades keep going off unpredictably, draining your energy, eroding your confidence, and making it feel impossible to fully heal. Identifying these triggers, intentionally processing the unresolved emotions attached to them, rather than letting them ambush you, and reducing contact with the people who planted them are the most powerful forms of resistance. Here's one that will make your blood boil once you recognize it. Someone deliberately pushes your buttons. They poke, provoke, and agitate you until you react. And then the moment you react, they turn around and hold your reaction up like a mirror and say, "See, this is what you're like. This is the real you." They made you explode, and now they're presenting the explosion as evidence of your instability. This is the emotional boomerang effect, and it is one of the most breathtakingly hypocritical manipulation tactics in existence. The choreography here is diabolical. The manipulator carefully engineers an emotional reaction, then feigns shock, disappointment, or concern at that reaction. Your anger, your sadness, your frustration, all of which were triggered on purpose, suddenly become the problem. Your emotions are no longer valid responses to their behaviour. They become proof that you're irrational, unstable, too sensitive. Gaslighting is deeply embedded in this process. Projection is right there too, because the manipulator is displacing their own responsibility onto your reaction. Shame induction seals the deal. Now you feel guilty for having feelings. You start suppressing your emotional responses to avoid giving them ammunition. Over time you go quiet. You stop expressing anything real. You become a muted, hollow version of yourself to survive the dynamic. This happens in romantic relationships where one partner constantly creates emotional crises and then criticizes the other for being upset. It happens in workplaces where a toxic boss drowns employees in stress and then calls them unprofessional for showing it. It happens in friendships, in families, in political spaces. The defense is to stop defending your emotions and start calling attention to the original trigger. Name the provocation before you discuss your reaction. Hold the other person accountable for what they did, not just what you felt in response to it. Gaslighting is something most people have heard of by now. But gaslight looping is the upgraded, nightmare version that most people have never encountered as a named concept. And that's precisely why it's so devastating when it happens. Standard gaslighting makes you question your reality. Gaslight looping does something worse. It makes you question your right to even try to figure out what's real. Every time you attempt to gain clarity, every time you try to push back against the fog, the loop pulls you right back in. The key feature that separates this from regular gaslighting is the perpetual contradiction. The manipulator doesn't just deny one specific thing. They shift positions constantly and unpredictably. Their story today contradicts what they said last week. When you point this out, they deny ever taking the previous position. When you try to verify your memory, they accuse you of being confused. When you express frustration at the confusion, they say your frustration proves their point about you being irrational. You are being gaslit about being gaslit. The illusory truth effect makes this devastatingly effective over time. The more often something is repeated, Regardless of whether it's true, the more real it begins to feel. The exhaustion tactics eventually beat you into submission, not through logic but through sheer mental fatigue. You stop trying to figure out the truth. It feels impossible. You just accept whatever version of reality costs you the least energy to live with, which happens to be the version the manipulator is selling. Keeping records, establishing external anchors of truth, and limiting contact with the manipulator are not just coping strategies. They are lifelines when you are drowning in a manufactured fog of infinite contradiction. Manipulation doesn't just hurt you, it sculpts you, intentionally, methodically. The way a sculptor chisels away at stone to create the shape they want. Trauma sculpting is the deliberate engineering of emotional wounds to ensure that a victim remains broken in exactly the right places to be useful to their abuser. This is not accidental cruelty. This is precision cruelty. Every wound is placed to serve a purpose. The process of trauma sculpting works through a brutal combination of tactics. The victim is made to feel fundamentally inadequate through systematic induced self-doubt. Emotional triggers are reinforced repeatedly through conditioning so that the victim lives in a baseline state of pain and instability. The manipulator then positions themselves as the only source of relief, deepening the dependency. And just when the victim is at their lowest, they get a small dose of validation, just enough to keep them hooked. Classical conditioning at its darkest. The cycle of hurt and momentary comfort creates a trauma bond that can be stronger than any other psychological chain because it mimics the structure of desperate love. The Stockholm effect is alive and well inside this dynamic. The victim becomes emotionally attached to the person destroying them because that person is also the only one offering moments of safety. This is seen in abusive relationships, in cult structures, in toxic family systems, in workplaces run by psychological predators. The long-term damage, immense. Chronic anxiety, identity dissolution, learned helplessness so profound that the victim cannot imagine an existence outside the abuser's orbit. Recovery requires not just removing yourself from the abuser, but actively rebuilding the identity that was chiseled away, piece by piece, through therapeutic work, self-rediscovery, and a patient reconstruction of self-trust. Your brain has a pleasure chemical. It's called dopamine, and it is responsible for the exquisite feeling of reward and anticipation. It's what fires when you achieve something, connect with someone, or experience something pleasurable. It is also, when weaponized, one of the most effective leashes ever invented for the human mind. The dopamine leash technique exploits your brain's reward circuitry with cold precision, creating an emotional dependency that operates almost identically to addiction. And once you understand how it works, you will see it everywhere. The core mechanism is intermittent reinforcement, not consistent praise, not consistent love, not consistent validation. Intermittent. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and you never know which one is coming. This unpredictability is the engine. Behavioral science has shown repeatedly that variable ratio reward systems, think slot machines, create the most powerful and resistant forms of conditioning. When you sometimes get the reward and sometimes don't, and the pattern is completely random, you become obsessed with pursuing it. You start chasing. That hit of validation with an intensity you'd never feel if it were given to you reliably. The manipulator alternates between warmth and withdrawal, between affection and cold silence, keeping you in a constant state of emotional hunger. You work harder, you comply more, you give more of yourself, all in pursuit of the next high. Abusive romantic partners use this with devastating effect. Employers who occasionally praise but mostly criticize have entire workforces dangling on this hook. Social. Media platforms are designed around this exact mechanism, the unpredictable notification, the occasional viral moment, the random burst of engagement. Cults use approval and rejection cycles to keep followers emotionally invested and too addicted to the group dynamic to leave. Breaking the dopamine leash requires something genuinely difficult. You have to stop needing the hit. You have to rebuild your sense of worth from the inside out, locating your sense of value in your own judgment rather than in their irregular bursts of warmth. Mind stringing is what happens when someone isn't just manipulating your emotions, but is literally operating your thought processes from the outside. It's psychological puppetry. The strings are invisible but real, made of conditioned responses, planted beliefs, and carefully nurtured dependencies that ensure you function in ways that serve the manipulator's agenda rather than your own authentic desires. The victim of mind stringing doesn't just feel controlled. They often don't feel controlled at all. They feel like they're making their own choices. That's the genius and the horror of it. Mind stringing is built over time through a systematic process of installing thought loops and behavioral reflexes. The manipulator subtly plants certain ideas until you believe they're your own. They condition you to crave their approval so that seeking their guidance feels natural, even voluntary. They use strategic contradictions to keep you perpetually confused, because a confused mind defaults to whatever authority seems most certain. They reward compliance and quietly punish independent thinking until choosing for yourself begins to feel dangerous. The victim ends up on psychological autopilot, reflexively checking with the manipulator before making decisions, living inside a framework of thought that wasn't designed for their flourishing but for their captivity. This is the operating system installed in members of high control groups. It's the dynamic in relationships where one partner seems to have absorbed the other's personality wholesale. It's the invisible infrastructure of corporate cultures that produce employees who are terrified to think differently from leadership. The exit strategy requires more than just leaving the physical situation. It requires a deliberate excavation of your own authentic thoughts and beliefs, separating what you actually think and value from what was installed by someone else. Empathy is sacred. It is the human superpower, the ability to genuinely feel what another person is experiencing and respond with care. But when someone takes that superpower and twists it into a mechanism of control, they become the master of their own destiny. The result is one of the most sophisticated and soul-crushing manipulation tactics imaginable. Reverse empathy exploitation is when a manipulator weaponizes the appearance of extreme empathy to shame you for not being empathetic enough, and in the process hijacks your compassion and turns it into a chain around your neck. Here's how it operates in practice. The manipulator positions themselves as incredibly emotionally attuned, deeply sensitive, profoundly caring. They make a constant show of their emotional generosity, and by contrast, they subtly frame you as someone who consistently falls short in the compassion department. You're not present enough. You're not considerate enough. You're too focused on your own needs. Every time you attempt to assert yourself, set a limit, or simply exist as a separate person with your own emotional life, it becomes evidence of your emotional inadequacy in their narrative. The cognitive dissonance this creates is excruciating. You're a caring person. You know you are. But this person keeps presenting evidence to the contrary, and their performance of empathy is so convincing that you begin to trust their assessment over your own. You start overcompensating, pouring more of your emotional energy into managing their feelings, suppressing your own needs, running yourself ragged, trying to reach a bar of empathy that was never meant to be reachable. Compassion fatigue sets in. Identity erosion follows. You lose track of where your emotional needs even are because you've spent so long ignoring them. Real empathy is mutual. It flows in both directions. When someone consistently positions themselves as the giver and you as the perpetually indebted receiver, that's not a relationship. That's a hierarchy of emotional exploitation, dressed up in the language of sensitivity. Real empathy never keeps score. It never announces itself loudly or presents itself as evidence of the other person's inadequacy. The moment compassion becomes a measuring stick used to make you feel small, it has been hijacked from its truest form. Some people wear a different face for every room they walk into. That's not always a red flag. Social adaptation is normal. But cognitive shape-shifting, the manipulation tactic, is something else entirely. It's the deliberate and strategic alteration of beliefs, values, opinions, and persona based on whoever the shapeshifter wants to control or impress at any given moment. And the most unsettling part is how smooth it looks. They never seem fake. They always seem perfectly aligned with whoever they're talking to, which is exactly the point. The cognitive shapeshifter's real talent is that they have no fixed stance and feel no discomfort about that. They'll be a progressive in one room and a conservative in another. They'll passionately defend an idea to one person and contradict it entirely to someone else. When confronted, they have an endless supply of explanations. They've grown, they were misunderstood, context changed, you're remembering it wrong. Every inconsistency is reframed as evolution, nuance, or complexity. The result is that holding them accountable becomes essentially impossible. There's nothing solid to grip. They are social mercury, always slipping away. Psychological damage to those around them is significant. Chronic confusion, self-doubt, an inability to form a stable and accurate picture of who this person actually is. Narcissists excel at this. Politicians are often masters of it. Some cult leaders have elevated it to performance art. The defense requires you to stop watching what they say and start watching what they consistently do. Because behaviour patterns are the only reliable footprint that cognitive shapeshifters leave behind. Now, let's pull back to the societal level, because manipulation doesn't just happen between two people. It can happen to entire civilizations. Hypernormalization is the phenomenon where an artificial, dysfunctional, contradictory reality is slowly introduced until it becomes so familiar that people accept it as just how things are. The absurd becomes normal. The corrupt becomes expected. The lie becomes the landscape. This term was born to describe Soviet-era propaganda, but its reach stretches far. Beyond any single political system, the mechanics are gradual and deliberate. Small distortions are introduced first, things that are slightly off but not alarming enough to provoke resistance. Over time, larger contradictions are folded in. Reality becomes increasingly strange, but because the strangeness has been introduced incrementally, the Overton window has shifted enough that nothing seems outrageous anymore. People who try to point out how bizarre things have become are dismissed as extremists or paranoids. The majority, exhausted by the constant cognitive effort of resisting the absurd, eventually just shrugs and accepts it. Learned helplessness sets in on a mass scale. Why fight what cannot be changed? Why question what everyone else seems to accept? The result is a population that is cognitively passive, ideologically malleable, and permanently vulnerable to whoever controls the narrative. The way to fight hypernormalization is not dramatic. It is patient and consistent. It's asking simple questions about what you're being told. It's comparing what you're shown against what you can verify independently. It's building communities with other people who refuse to normalize what should never be normalized. It's the deliberate, almost stubborn act of staying mentally awake when everything around you is designed to put you to sleep. Hypernormalization doesn't need your active agreement. It only needs your passive acceptance. And the most revolutionary thing you can do in a manufactured reality is simply to keep demanding that reality makes sense. The guilty drain operates so quietly that most people don't even realize it's draining them until they're running on empty. The insidious guilt drain is a slow and methodical manipulation strategy in which a person is made to feel perpetually responsible for the emotional well-being and happiness of someone else, not through direct accusation but through implication, tone, atmosphere, and the subtle suggestion that they are never quite doing enough. It is guilt used as a slow bleed rather than a sudden wound. What makes this technique so hard to defend against is precisely its subtlety. Nothing is ever explicitly said. You're never formally accused. But somehow every interaction leaves you feeling like you've failed. Like you owe more. Like you are the reason this person is unhappy. You start reorganizing your life around reducing their discomfort. You start measuring your worth by how little displeasure you cause. Your own desires and needs get pushed further and further down the priority list until they disappear entirely. This is a power structure built entirely from implication and the victim's own moral responsibility reflexes. Parents use it to keep adult children emotionally tethered. Partners use it to prevent their significant other from developing independence. Employers use it to extract labor beyond what is fair or healthy. Religious institutions use it to maintain compliance through a permanent state of inadequacy. The path out requires one fundamental recognition. You are not responsible for managing another adult's emotional life. Full stop. Setting that boundary is not cruelty. It is sanity. It is the most honest thing you can do, both for yourself and for the person who has been using your guilt as their power supply. Emotional labor is not infinite, and a person who treats it as if it is, who keeps drawing from your well without ever putting anything back, is not someone who loves you. They are someone who needs you depleted. Fear echo manipulation is fear's most patient cousin. It doesn't scare you fresh every time. Instead, it reaches back into your history, into your old wounds and buried anxieties, and it breathes life into them in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. A word here, a tone there, a reference to something that once made you unravel. The manipulator doesn't need to create new fears. They have your archive. They just know how to play it. The classical conditioning embedded in this technique is sophisticated. Over time, specific words, phrases, settings, or tones become neurologically linked to past states of fear or distress. A manipulator who knows your history knows exactly which keys to press to unlock those stored emotional responses without ever having to make an explicit threat. You react not to what's happening now, but to what happened then, and the manipulator counts on that gap between stimulus and memory to keep you destabilized. The Zeigarnik effect is at work here too. Unresolved traumas are always closer to the surface than fully processed ones, and a skilled fear echo manipulator keeps those traumas from ever fully healing by periodically resurrecting them. The result is a person who lives in a state of chronic anticipatory anxiety, always half expecting the next emotional ambush, always slightly off balance, always just vulnerable enough to be steered. Breaking this requires deliberately processing the original fears rather than letting them remain live wires someone else can access at will. Healing is not forgetting, it is reclassifying. It is taking something that was raw and exposed and doing the internal work to transform it into something integrated and no longer triggerable from the outside. That work is uncomfortable and it takes time, but it is the only thing that actually severs the manipulator's access to your history. Overthinking is exhausting on its own. Now imagine someone deliberately engineering it. Cognitive hijacking is the tactic of intentionally overloading a person with excessive, conflicting, or ambiguous information to disrupt their ability to think clearly, make decisions, or trust their own judgment. The goal isn't to argue you into a corner. It's to drown you in so much complexity that you give up trying to navigate it yourself and hand the steering wheel to whoever seems to have the answers. And conveniently, that's always the manipulator. The paradox of choice is one psychological principle at play here. When faced with too many options, the human brain doesn't become more empowered. It freezes. Decision fatigue is real and measurable. When someone is given conflicting information, forced to juggle multiple contradictory frameworks simultaneously, or subjected to constant ambiguity and second-guessing, their cognitive resources deplete rapidly. They become desperate for simplicity, for someone to just tell them what to think or do. Corporate environments use this by creating Byzantine systems of meetings, vague mandates, and constantly shifting expectations that keep employees so busy trying to understand the rules that they never have bandwidth to question whether the rules make sense. Political propaganda deploys it by flooding media with so much noise and so many competing narratives that ordinary people abandon the project of figuring out what's true and retreat to whatever voice feels the most confident. Cults overwhelm recruits with information, questions, and moral dilemmas until independent thought feels not just difficult but physically exhausting. The antidote is radical simplification. Fewer inputs, clearer questions, shorter timeframes for decision-making, and a hard stop on the spiral of analysis that never arrives anywhere. Clarity is not a luxury that complex thinkers earn after enough deliberation. It is your fundamental right. Refusing to be mentally drowned is not intellectual weakness. It is survival intelligence, and the most powerful people in any system are those who refuse to let the noise win. The dark triad, that charming constellation of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, is well established in psychological literature as a cluster of traits associated with manipulation and emotional predation. But dark triad anchoring is a specific tactic that even researchers rarely discuss openly. It is the process of projecting these toxic traits onto someone else, systematically and relentlessly, until the victim believes that they, not the manipulator, are the dangerous one. The manipulator gets to play the long-suffering victim of a narcissist or psychopath, when in reality they are orchestrating the whole narrative from behind a mask. The genius of this tactic, if we can use that word for something so destructive, is that it turns the victim's self-awareness against them. People with genuinely good values, people who care about being ethical and fair, are deeply troubled by the idea that they might be causing harm. So when someone convincingly accuses them of being manipulative, self-centered, or emotionally abusive, they don't immediately reject the accusation. They examine themselves, they apologize, they try to do better. And the manipulator uses every moment of that sincere self-examination to deepen the false narrative, to gather more ammunition, and to further cement their own position as the wronged party. Meanwhile, their actual behaviour goes unexamined and unchallenged, because the victim is too busy defending against accusations to analyse what the accuser is actually doing. The illusory truth effect means that if you hear the same accusation about yourself enough times, it starts to feel true regardless of evidence. The defense requires holding on to your own factual record of events with both hands and seeking perspective from people outside the dynamic, who can see clearly what you cannot. An outside perspective, not a sign of weakness. It is the most rational thing you can do when someone has been systematically dismantling your ability to trust your own perception, because sometimes the clearest truth about your situation lies in the eyes of someone who isn't trapped inside the fog with you. And what happens to a person who has been manipulated long enough and thoroughly enough? What is the end state toward which all of these tactics are driving? The empty vessel phenomenon is the answer. It is the condition of having had your sense of self systematically removed or never allowed to form in the first place, leaving behind a person who is exquisitely vulnerable to being filled with whatever beliefs, values, and identity someone else wants to pour in. Manipulators, cult leaders, controlling partners, overbearing parents, they all seek to create empty vessels, whether consciously or intuitively, because a person without a solid self is infinitely easier to shape and control. The tragedy is that it often happens without anyone ever saying, "I want to destroy your identity." It happens through the consistent suppression of independent thought, through the punishment of genuine self-expression, through the creation of emotional environments where being yourself feels too dangerous. Over time, the person learns not to trust their own instincts, not to rely on their own judgment, not to define their own values. They become extraordinarily attuned to external cues about what to think, feel, and believe because their internal compass was broken or was never allowed to develop. They gravitate towards structures, ideologies, and relationships that offer a ready-made identity in exchange for their compliance. The vulnerability this creates is staggering. They can be molded, directed, and redirected with alarming ease. Recovery is not about filling the emptiness with new content. It's about learning that you have always had the capacity to generate your own content, and that the emptiness was manufactured, not inherent. Compliance is mostly treated as a virtue. We tell children to cooperate. We reward agreement. We socially penalize those who resist or refuse. And a manipulator who understands this social conditioning can use it to gradually walk a person across a line they never intended to cross, one tiny agreeable step at a time. The compliance paradox is the uncomfortable truth that the very social behaviors that make us functional in community also make us systematically exploitable. By the time the demands become unreasonable, you've already built up enough of a compliance habit that refusing feels like a violation of your own behavioral history. The foot-in-the-door technique is the classic articulation of this. Start small. Get agreement to something minor, even trivially minor, then slightly escalate. Each yes makes the next yes feel more inevitable. Each concession becomes a psychological precedent. The sunk cost fallacy kicks in. You've already agreed to so much, invested so much, normalized so much, that refusing now feels like throwing all of that away. Social conditioning does the rest, because in most cultures, saying no, especially repeatedly, feels aggressive, difficult, ungrateful. Manipulators exploit this conditioning ruthlessly. Toxic relationships start with small sacrifices that seem like expressions of love before escalating to complete self-erasure. Cult induction follows the same arc. Minor lifestyle commitments, slowly becoming total ideological surrender. Political systems normalize incremental erosions of rights until the public are living in conditions they would have found utterly unacceptable just a generation earlier. The defense is simple in theory and brutal in practice. You have to say no early. Not when the demands become extreme. Early, before the pattern gets established. Because once the pattern of compliance is in place, every subsequent no feels like a rupture rather than a right. And, finally, we arrive at perhaps the most elegant trap of all, one that comes dressed in warmth, generosity, and the appearance of unconditional care. The benevolent trap is the manipulation of kindness, the weaponization of generosity, the use of gifts and support and affection as a currency of obligation. When someone does something nice for you, every human social instinct fires at once. Gratitude, the urge to reciprocate, the sense of debt. Manipulators know this. They depend on it. They invest in you strategically, not because they care about your flourishing, but because they are building a credit line of obligation that they intend to cash in on their terms and on their timeline. The benevolent trap works because it exploits some of the best parts of human nature. Our gratitude, our social reciprocity instincts, our discomfort with seeming ungrateful or selfish. These are not flaws. They are features of a healthy social animal, but they become liabilities when someone is deliberately engineering generosity as a control mechanism. The gifts are too grand. The support is too perfectly timed. The emotional investment is offered with an intensity that feels almost overwhelming in its warmth. And then, slowly, the bill arrives, not in money, in compliance, in the expectation that you will be available when called upon, that you will not set limits, that you will not question, that you will not leave. The conditional nature of this support usually becomes visible only when you try to assert yourself, because that's when the warmth suddenly cools and the implied debt gets loudly mentioned. The emotional exhaustion of living inside a benevolent trap is profound because you can never fully enjoy the kindness. There's always the faint awareness of the string attached to it, even if you can't always see it clearly. True generosity has no invoice. True care does not accumulate interest. And learning to recognize the difference between genuine warmth and calculated investment is one of the most important things a human being can ever do for their own freedom. Understanding all of these mechanisms is not about becoming paranoid. It's not about viewing every act of connection as a potential trap or every person who understands you as a threat. It is about becoming genuinely awake to the extraordinary complexity of human influence, the many subtle ways that minds can be shaped, redirected, conditioned, and captured. Knowledge is not cynicism. It is the opposite of helplessness. When you understand how the dopamine leash works, you can recognize when your cravings are being engineered. When you know what gaslight looping looks like, you can identify the fog before you're already lost in it. When you understand the compliance paradox, you can catch yourself before 50 small yeses have made a giant no-feel impossible. The most powerful thing any human being can do is to understand the architecture of their own vulnerability and choose, deliberately and with open eyes, how to move through a world that contains both profound, genuine connection and profound, calculated predation. Stay curious, stay grounded, and trust that awareness, more than anything else you will ever develop, is the shield that stands between you and the many silent architectures of control this world has quietly built around you.